Richard Hale had always believed in control. Every wall, every floor, every beam of his estate above Lake Washington was engineered to exacting specifications. Soundproofing was paramount. The house was so quiet it could swallow a pin drop. He told visitors it was serene, but for Richard it was more than serenity, it was predictability. In a life where deals fell apart with the wrong word, where a single misstep could cost millions, silence was a sanctuary. And yet, on a night that began like any other, that sanctuary betrayed him. He had been asleep, or at least he thought he was, when the first whisper brushed past the edge of his consciousness. Soft, almost a thread in the darkness, it carried a phrase he could barely catch. "Don't tell him yet." His eyes snapped open. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed 1:42 a.m., oddly specific, oddly precise. He listened, straining in the dark. His bedroom was the quietest part of the house, the thick curtains muffling the lake wind. The hum of the HVAC system was designed to be subliminal, but tonight even that calm background felt intrusive, like it was highlighting the whisper. Richard swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, bare feet on the cool oak. He paused, letting the silence around him stretch, trying to convince himself he had imagined it. His mind ran through possibilities: a faulty speaker, a dream, a glitch in the smart home system. Anything rational. Yet something in the cadence of the words, the pause before, yet, felt deliberate, personal. He moved toward the stairs, each step careful, his eyes adjusting to the faint nightlight strips along the baseboards. The whisper came again, lower this time, almost swallowed by the shadows. "He won't forgive you." Richard's chest tightened. Not fear exactly, something more insidious. Recognition maybe. Or guilt. He froze, hand gripping the polished railing. The words didn't make sense. No one had reason to be here. The security system would have screamed through every alert imaginable. Yet the tone, the hesitation in the voice, felt intimate, familiar even. He stopped listening to reason and started listening to instinct. "Who's there?" His voice cracked slightly, though he didn't realize it at first. Silence answered him. He waited, counting his own heartbeats, long and irregular. He could feel his body react in ways he hadn't in years. A tremor, a tightening in his chest, a rush of adrenaline that left his fingers tingling. His mind flicked to Eleanor. His wife. The woman who had died almost a year ago. Surely not her. That was impossible. And yet, Richard's pride, his armor, kicked in. He turned back upstairs, reminding himself he was 62, a man who had survived hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, and public humiliation. He did not get rattled by whispers in a house, no matter how eerie. Back in his bedroom, he double-checked the locks, even though they were never truly necessary. He told himself that tomorrow he'd call Thomas, his house manager, a meticulous man who handled everything from accounting errors to midnight plumbing crises. But tonight he would stay awake, watching, waiting. Hours stretched like taffy. The wind whispered against the windows, and every creak of the house sounded like someone stepping closer. Richard tried reading, scrolling through the financial reports on his tablet, but his eyes wouldn't focus. Every flicker of light on the screen felt like an intruder. And then, just as exhaustion threatened to pull him under, he heard it again. Clear. Sharper. Richard. It wasn't the voice itself that made him pause. It was the familiarity, the rhythm. The way the name fell across the room, as if someone had practiced it, studied it, known exactly how it would feel to land in his ears. His heart thudded in a way that made him lean against the bedpost for support. He had felt adrenaline, guilt, grief, and fear all separately, but never tangled together like this. Something deep in his chest trembled, a physical reaction he didn't understand. And for the first time in years, in a life built on certainty, he felt completely unmoored. Richard didn't call out. Not yet. He stayed still, listening, counting seconds that became minutes, every muscle taut, every nerve alive. The house was silent again, but he knew it wasn't over. Something, or someone, was down there waiting, watching, whispering. And whatever it was, it had his attention completely. If you're following along, make sure you subscribe. This story just gets stranger from here. And hey, comment below where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this whisper has traveled. Richard exhaled, a shallow breath he didn't know he was holding, and stared at the staircase. He had two choices: go back to bed and ignore it, or descend into the silence to confront whatever lurked downstairs. And when he made his choice, he had no idea that nothing in his carefully controlled life would ever feel normal again. Richard did not go back to sleep. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of his own name over and over. Not the word itself, but the way it had been spoken. The slight hesitation before it. The softness, as if the speaker wasn't sure they were allowed to say it out loud. That detail refused to leave him alone. By morning, exhaustion pressed behind his eyes like a dull headache. He showered longer than usual, letting the hot water pound against his shoulders, hoping it would rinse the night away. It didn't. The house looked the same as it always had, clean lines, neutral colors, glass and steel arranged with obsessive intention. But it felt altered, like a familiar face you suddenly notice watching you back. At 8 sharp, Thomas Kearns arrived. Thomas was the kind of man who never raised his voice and never seemed rushed. He wore the same pressed button-downs, the same quiet expression. If anything in Richard's life could be described as dependable, it was Thomas. They sat at the kitchen island, sunlight spilling in through the windows. The normalcy of the moment almost made Richard doubt himself. "I heard something last night," Richard said finally. Thomas nodded once. "What kind of something?" "A voice." Richard watched Thomas's face closely. "Downstairs." Thomas didn't react. Not immediately. He took a sip of coffee, then set the mug down with care. "Did the security system alert?" "No." "Any devices active? Speakers, televisions, intercoms?" "No." Thomas folded his hands. "Could you describe the voice?" Richard hesitated. It was quiet, almost careful. Thomas waited. "It used my name." "That did it?" Just a flicker. So small Richard might have missed it if he hadn't been looking for it. Thomas's eyes shifted, just briefly, before settling again. "I'll check the system logs," Thomas said. "Every sensor. Every device." "I want to be there," Richard replied. They walked the house together, room by room. Thomas moved efficiently, pulling up diagnostics on his tablet, narrating as he went. Motion sensors, clear. Door logs, no entries. Audio devices, inactive. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. By noon, Thomas stood in the living room, tablet lowered. "There's no record of anything unusual." Richard nodded slowly. He should have felt relieved. Instead, a quiet unease settled deeper into his chest. Could it be stress? Thomas offered. Sleep deprivation can cause auditory hallucinations, especially after loss. The word loss landed heavier than it should have. "Maybe," Richard said, though he didn't believe it. That afternoon he tried to work. Video calls blurred together. People spoke, but he found himself watching their mouths instead of listening. When the calls ended, the silence rushed back in, thick and expectant. By evening, Richard felt foolish. The whispers had happened once, twice if he counted the name. That was all. He poured a glass of whiskey and stood by the window, watching the lake darken. The water was smooth, undisturbed, reflecting the last light of day. He told himself that if nothing happened tonight, he'd let it go. The house lights dimmed automatically at 10. Richard stayed in the living room, sitting on the edge of the sofa instead of retreating upstairs. He didn't want to be caught unaware again. Midnight passed. At 1:17 a.m., the whisper returned. This time there was no doubt. "He's still pretending." Richard stood so fast the glass tipped, amber liquid spilling onto the rug. He didn't notice. The voice hadn't come from the stairs. It hadn't come from the walls. It had come from somewhere behind him. "We can't keep doing this." Another voice answered, quieter. He's not ready. Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. His mouth felt dry, his tongue thick. These weren't fragments anymore. This was a conversation. "Who's there?" he demanded. Silence snapped shut, abrupt and complete. Richard's heart hammered as he turned slowly, scanning the room. Empty. Every shadow exactly where it belonged. He took a step forward, then another, listening hard enough that his ears ached. Then he realized something that made his stomach drop. The sound hadn't filled the room. It had direction. The whispers had come from farther back, beyond the living room, toward the service corridor. Richard hadn't thought about that corridor in years. He rarely acknowledged its existence. It led to storage rooms he didn't use, spaces he'd ordered sealed off after Eleanor's illness worsened. He'd told himself it was practical. Less space to manage. Less to maintain. Less to remember. The whisper came again, barely audible now, as if retreating. He has to hear it. Richard stood at the edge of the hallway, staring at the paneling that concealed the corridor door. His reflection stared back faintly, distorted by the low light. For a moment he considered calling Thomas, or the police, or anyone. Instead he reached out and pressed his palm against the wall. He felt it then. A vibration. Subtle but real. Something was active behind it. Richard swallowed. Whatever was happening in his house was no longer content to stay hidden. And as he stood there, heart trembling, he understood one unsettling truth with absolute clarity. This wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Richard slept less than 2 hours. What little rest he managed was shallow and fractured, filled with half-dreams that dissolved the moment he opened his eyes. By dawn, his body felt heavy, but his mind refused to slow down. The whispers had direction now. Purpose. That realization followed him like a shadow as he moved through the morning. He dressed carefully, mechanically, as if routine could anchor him. A pressed shirt. Cufflinks aligned. Shoes polished though no one would see them. He caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. The face was familiar, but the eyes looked alert in a way he hadn't felt in years. Not sharp. Wary. Downstairs, the house greeted him with obedient silence. Too obedient. He walked the length of the living room, listening for anything, air moving, wood settling, the faintest hint of sound. Nothing. The paneling along the hallway looked seamless, flawless. If he hadn't felt the vibration the night before, he might have convinced himself the corridor wasn't even there. Richard stood there longer than necessary, then turned away. He told himself he needed proof. Something tangible. Wealth had taught him that feelings were unreliable, but systems, records, and patterns told the truth. If there was a source to the sound, it would leave a trail. He pulled up the house's internal logs on his tablet. Audio activity. Power usage. Network traffic. Everything looked clean at first glance. Then he noticed it. A narrow spike in power draw. Small. Almost negligible. But it appeared every night around the same time. Always after midnight. Always localized to the lower level. Richard zoomed in, his finger steady despite the thudding in his chest. The spike didn't match any known device. Not lighting. Not climate control. Something else. Okay, he muttered to himself. So you're real. The word echoed in the quiet kitchen, and he immediately regretted saying it out loud. He spent the rest of the morning chasing rational explanations. He called the company that managed the house's systems. They assured him everything was functioning normally. He scheduled an inspection anyway. Then another. He considered calling a sleep specialist, then dismissed the idea. Hallucinations didn't leave power signatures. By afternoon, frustration replaced fear. Richard had spent decades refusing to be manipulated. By competitors. By markets. By people who thought they knew him. And yet here he was, jumping at shadows in his own home. He drove into the city for a meeting he could not cancel, forcing himself to focus. For an hour he almost succeeded. But when a colleague said his name across the table, Richard flinched. That pause, the same pause as the whisper, rang in his ears. He ended the meeting early. Back at the estate, dusk settled in with unsettling speed. The lake darkened, glassy and still. Richard skipped dinner. Hunger felt irrelevant compared to the tight coil in his chest. At 10:30, he did something he hadn't done since Eleanor was alive. He turned off the automation. Lights, climate presets, ambient sound masking. All of it went dark and quiet at once. The house felt larger without its systems humming softly in the background. More hollow. Richard sat in the living room, this time with the lights fully on. He placed a chair facing the hallway and waited. Minutes passed. An hour. Nothing. Just as doubt crept back in, the lights flickered. Not a full outage. Just a brief dip like the house had blinked. Then the whisper came. "You said you'd stop." Richard stood. His legs felt unsteady, but he forced himself forward. "Show yourself," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. The whisper answered, closer now. "He deserves the truth." Richard stepped into the hallway. The paneling loomed on either side, smooth and unbroken. He pressed his ear to the wall, listening. A faint sound answered him. Not a voice. Breathing. Slow. Controlled. Human. Richard stepped back, heart pounding. Someone was behind that wall. Someone alive. Someone who had been there long enough to know his routines, his grief, his name. The implications settled heavily on him. This wasn't a malfunction. This wasn't his mind. This was intrusion. He reached for his phone, then stopped. A thought occurred to him, cold and unsettling. Whoever was behind that wall had chosen not to confront him directly. They wanted him unsettled. Listening. Questioning himself. That meant one thing. They believed he was hiding from something. Richard lowered his phone and turned toward the concealed door, his hand hovering inches from the seam in the paneling. Whatever waited on the other side had been patient. And patience, he knew better than anyone, was never accidental. Richard didn't touch the wall. He stood there, hand hovering inches from the seam in the paneling, listening to the breathing fade until it was impossible to tell whether it had ever been real. The hallway felt narrower now, the air heavier. His heart beat hard enough to make his vision pulse. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped back. Whatever was happening, he wasn't ready to tear the house open in the middle of the night. That kind of impulsiveness had cost him before. Contracts signed too fast, warnings ignored because he believed urgency was a weakness. He wasn't going to make the same mistake now. He returned to the living room, sat down and waited. The whisper didn't come back. Morning arrived like an accusation. Pale light crept across the lake, exposing the house in full clarity. Everything looked normal. Pristine. The paneling flawless. The hallway empty. If Richard hadn't felt the vibration, hadn't heard the breathing, he might have convinced himself it was all a stress-induced episode. But his body remembered. His chest still felt tight. His shoulders ached from tension he hadn't released. And beneath it all sat a quiet certainty that unsettled him more than fear. Someone had wanted him awake. Thomas arrived at 9. He greeted Richard with the same polite calm as always, but something in his tone shifted when Richard didn't offer coffee. "I want every inch of the lower level checked," Richard said. Again. Thomas didn't argue. Of course. They moved methodically. Storage rooms. Utility closets. Mechanical access points. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. No unauthorized equipment. At the hallway paneling, Thomas paused. "This door," Richard said. "Was it ever reopened?" Thomas shook his head. "Not since you ordered it sealed." Richard watched him closely. "Did anyone else have reason to access it?" "Only me," Thomas replied. "And only for inspections." Richard nodded. He wanted to believe that. Thomas had been with him through Eleanor's illness, through the long nights and shorter temper. He had seen things few others had. Loyalty mattered to Richard. He rewarded it. Still, doubt slipped in quietly. After Thomas left, Richard sat alone in his office, staring at a framed photograph he hadn't looked at in months. Eleanor stood beside him at a charity gala, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She was smiling, but it wasn't the wide, practiced smile she used in public. It was smaller, private. "You look like you're somewhere else," she had said that night. He brushed it off, promised to listen later. Later had never come. That evening Richard skipped dinner again. Hunger felt like an inconvenience. He paced the house instead, testing rooms, opening doors, listening. Every sound seemed amplified. The faint click of cooling metal. The distant splash of water against the dock. At 1:39 a.m. he stopped pacing. The house was too quiet. At 1:42 the whisper returned. "Richard." It came from the living room this time. Clearer than before. Close enough that he felt it brush against him like a breath. He turned slowly. "Say it again," he said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. Silence followed. Then, softly, "You always pretend you don't hear." His knees went weak. It wasn't just the words. It was the phrasing, the rhythm, the familiar impatience wrapped in restraint. Eleanor used to say that exact sentence when he buried himself in work. When he stared at screens instead of at her. "No," he whispered. "That's not possible." The whisper answered almost sadly, "You said that too." Richard backed away until he hit the edge of the sofa. His mind raced, scrambling for explanations. Someone had studied her, learned her patterns, mimicked her voice. That was possible. Disturbing but possible. But this wasn't mimicry. This was memory. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want from me?" The whisper didn't respond immediately. When it did, the words were quieter, waited. To listen. A sharp sound escaped Richard's throat, halfway between a laugh and a sob. He pressed his hands against his face, breathing hard. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, but this cracked something open in him he'd sealed years ago. "You're not real," he said. "You can't be." The whisper drifted closer. "I was." Richard lowered his hands. The room felt wrong now. Smaller. Charged. The lights overhead seemed too bright, the shadows too sharp. "Stop," he said. "Just stop." For a moment he thought it had obeyed. Then came the final whisper of the night, softer than all the others, spoken not with accusation but with certainty. "You're not ready yet." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stood there long after the sound faded, his heart pounding, his hands trembling at his sides. Whatever this was, whoever was doing this, they knew him. Not the public version. Not the man on magazine covers. They knew the parts he had buried. And for the first time since Eleanor's death, Richard felt something break through the numbness he'd been living inside. Fear. Not of what he was hearing, but of what he might finally be forced to remember. Richard didn't sleep that night either. By now he had stopped trying. The bed felt alien, too soft, too empty, the shadows stretching across the walls like old memories he could not escape. The whispers had returned with the same unsettling clarity, but this time, Richard decided not to react outwardly. He stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting the cadence of the words press against him, trying to catch meaning, any clue to what, or who, was behind them. Morning arrived sluggishly, with the sun casting pale streaks across the living room through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He made himself coffee, black, the aroma doing nothing to shake the weight in his chest. He avoided checking the lower level, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. That corridor, sealed and forgotten, suddenly seemed alive, humming with a presence he couldn't yet define. By 10 he had called Thomas again. The house manager arrived with his usual quiet efficiency, though today his eyes flicked more than once toward the hallway paneling. Richard didn't mention it. He didn't need to. He already knew Thomas was thinking the same thing he was. Someone had been in the house without permission. Someone had been testing him. "I want every sensor checked again," Richard said, standing by the living room table. "Every camera, every motion detector, every device connected to the system. Even the basement storage." Thomas nodded. "We'll go through it thoroughly." You'll have a report by this afternoon. Richard studied him, looking for hesitation. Nothing. But the tension in the air was thicker than any electronic signal. Alone, Richard paced the living room, running his hands along the back of the sofa, tracing its edges like a man trying to feel the world for hidden cracks. Every creak of the house sounded amplified tonight. The wind tapped against the glass doors with a rhythm that felt deliberate. A shadow flitted across the far wall. He stopped, heart hammering. Nothing. By 1:30 a.m. he decided he couldn't wait. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped toward the hallway. His bare feet were soundless on the polished floor. The paneling loomed before him, smooth and unbroken. He ran his fingertips along the seam, feeling the cool, unyielding surface. The whispers had started again, a hushed, fragmented conversation, distant but distinct. He won't understand, not yet. Richard froze. Every muscle tightened. He could feel the pulse in his throat, his chest, even in his fingertips. The words weren't meant for him, or maybe they were, but they carried urgency, secrecy. Just wait for the right moment. He inhaled sharply. The voice had come from inside the wall, from the sealed corridor. His hand pressed against the paneling. The vibration was faint but unmistakable. Something, or someone, was behind it. Alive. Real. Deliberate. Richard stepped back, his mind racing. Every rational explanation he could muster, technical malfunction, hallucination, sleep-deprived imagination, crumbled under the weight of proof he could feel, hear, and almost touch. He could call Thomas. He could leave the house. He could lock himself in his office and pretend none of this existed. But he didn't. Instead, he did the only thing that made sense to him. He listened. The whispers became clearer, more urgent. He can't hide forever. Richard's pulse raced. He wanted to know the source, to confront it, but fear rooted him in place. Not fear of harm, not yet. Fear of revelation. Fear of confronting parts of himself he had carefully buried. He must see it, the voice said, before it's too late. Richard's chest tightened, a deep, physical ache. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but another part of him, the part that had built empires and faced enemies without flinching, urged him forward. He stepped closer. Then the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Absolute. Watching him. Waiting. Richard's hand hovered over the paneling, trembling slightly. The house seemed to breathe around him, the shadows deepening, the air dense with anticipation. Whatever, or whoever, was behind that wall, they had been patient. They had calculated every step, every heartbeat, every response. And now, standing there alone in the dim light, Richard realized that patience carried its own kind of power. He wasn't just being tested. He was being confronted. And whatever came next, he knew it would change everything. The paneling before him remained smooth and unyielding, silent, secretive, waiting. And Richard knew one thing with absolute certainty. He could no longer ignore it. Richard left the house before sunrise. Not because he wanted to, but because staying felt dangerous in a way he couldn't articulate. The silence had grown heavy, watchful. As he drove down the long gravel path toward the main road, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. The house stood calm and unmoving, glass reflecting the pale sky, giving nothing away. It looked innocent. That unsettled him more than the whispers. He spent the morning in motion, chasing distraction. A walk along the waterfront. A too-strong coffee at a cafe he rarely visited. People moved around him, laughing, arguing, living loudly. It should have grounded him. Instead, he felt slightly out of sync, like he was observing life through thick glass. Every so often his name echoed in his head. Not imagined. Remembered. By late morning, frustration overtook caution. He drove back to the estate with a single decision fixed in his mind. If someone was manipulating him, learning his patterns, exploiting his grief, then he would stop waiting and start pressing back. He called Thomas as soon as he stepped inside. "I want a full sweep," Richard said. Not just systems. Physical inspection. Walls. Floors. Anything that doesn't belong. There was a pause on the other end. Brief but noticeable. That's extensive, Thomas said carefully. So is what's happening in my house. Another pause. I'll bring a team. No, Richard said. Just you. Silence stretched between them, thin and tense. All right, Thomas replied. I'll be there within the hour. Richard hung up and walked through the living room, his footsteps echoing louder than usual. He noticed things he hadn't before. A faint scuff near the baseboard. A vent cover slightly misaligned. Harmless details maybe. Or evidence hiding in plain sight. When Thomas arrived, he carried a small toolkit instead of his tablet. That detail lodged itself in Richard's mind. They started with the lower level. Storage rooms first. Boxes untouched for years. Old furniture draped in sheets. Nothing obvious. Too obvious, Richard thought. Finally, they stood before the hallway paneling. Thomas rested a hand on the wall. You're certain the sound came from here? Yes. Thomas nodded, then knelt, examining the seam. His movements were slow, deliberate. Richard watched closely, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided eye contact. You never told me, Richard said quietly, why this corridor was sealed so completely. Thomas didn't look up. You said you didn't want reminders. That's not an answer. Thomas straightened, meeting his gaze. You were in pain. You didn't want people wandering near the rooms where she stayed. I respected that. Did you? Richard asked. Something flickered across Thomas's face. Not guilt. Something closer to resolve. Before Richard could press further, Thomas tapped the wall with his knuckles. The sound came back wrong. Hollow. Richard's stomach tightened. Thomas exhaled slowly. There's space behind this section that shouldn't be here. Richard stared at the wall. What kind of space? Enough for wiring, Thomas said. Or equipment. Or a person. Richard's jaw clenched. Open it. Thomas hesitated. Just for a second. Then he set his tools down and began working the panel free. The sound of the latch releasing was soft, almost polite. The panel shifted outward, revealing darkness beyond. Cool air spilled into the hallway, carrying a faint metallic smell. Richard stepped forward. Careful, Thomas said. Richard ignored him. Inside was a narrow corridor, dimly lit by a single low-watt bulb. Wires ran along one wall, neat and intentional. At the far end, a closed door. This wasn't here, Richard said. No, Thomas replied. It wasn't. Richard turned slowly. You installed this. Thomas didn't deny it. I needed a place, Thomas said quietly. Somewhere private. Somewhere controlled. For what? Richard demanded. Thomas looked past him, down the corridor toward the door. For something you weren't ready to face. Richard felt heat rise in his chest. You don't get to decide that. I know, Thomas said. But I did. Silence pressed in, thick and heavy. What's behind that door? Richard asked. Thomas swallowed. Not what you think. Richard took a step toward it. The whisper came then. Not from the wall. Not from behind them. From the corridor itself. He's getting closer. Richard froze. The voice wasn't addressing him. It was warning someone else. He turned sharply toward Thomas, whose face had gone pale. You hear it too, Richard said. Thomas nodded once. Yes. The realization hit Richard like a cold wave. This wasn't just happening to him. It never had been. Whatever waited behind that door wasn't improvising anymore. It was prepared. And as Richard reached for the handle, he understood with chilling clarity that opening it would mean crossing a line he could never step back over. Richard did not open the door. Not yet. He stood in the narrow corridor, fingers hovering inches from the handle, every sense sharpened to a painful edge. The light above flickered faintly, buzzing like an insect trapped in glass. The air smelled old, metal, dust, something faintly chemical. The kind of smell that suggested long-term planning, not a sudden impulse. Behind him, Thomas remained still. Too still. Richard slowly lowered his hand. "We're stepping back," he said. His voice sounded calmer than he felt. "Now." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. They retreated together, the corridor swallowing its own shadows as Richard pulled the panel shut. The soft click of it resealing felt louder than a slammed door. Back in the living room, the space felt wrong. Larger than before. Exposed. Richard rubbed his palms together, trying to ground himself. "You said this wasn't what I think," Richard said. "So tell me what you think I think." Thomas exhaled through his nose. "That someone's living in your walls. Watching you. And that they're trying to scare you." Richard held his gaze. "Aren't they?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, staring out at the lake. The water was still, dark, indifferent. "They're trying to reach you," Thomas said finally. Richard laughed once, sharply. "By whispering my name at night?" "Yes." "That's not reaching," Richard snapped. "That's trespassing." Thomas turned. "You wouldn't have listened any other way." Silence settled between them again, thick with accusation. "Go," Richard said. Thomas's brow furrowed. "Richard." "Leave," he repeated. "We'll talk later." Thomas nodded, stiffly this time, and left without another word. The house swallowed the sound of his departure too quickly. Richard locked the doors. All of them. Then he stood in the middle of the living room, hands on his hips, breathing hard. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation began to drain, leaving something colder behind. If Thomas was involved, and he was, then the whispers weren't random. They were curated. Designed. Which meant they would come back. That night, Richard didn't sit in the living room. He turned off the lights and stayed upstairs, door open, listening. The darkness pressed in closer than before, every sound magnified. Pipes ticked. The house settled. The lake wind brushed faintly against the glass. At 12:58 a.m., the whisper returned. "You shouldn't have shown him." Richard sat up in bed, heart pounding. Another voice answered. It was time. These weren't arguments anymore. They were disagreements. Familiar ones. "He gets angry first. He always does." Richard swung his legs over the bed and stood. His pulse roared in his ears as he moved toward the stairs, drawn by the sound like gravity. "He thinks control is the same as strength." The words hit him square in the chest. "Stop talking about me," he said aloud. The whispers paused. Then, softly, almost amused, "See." Richard descended the stairs slowly, barefoot, each step deliberate. The voices were clearer now, not echoing, not distorted. They sounded close. Human. "He's listening now," one whispered. "Don't rush him." Richard reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. "Who are you talking to?" he demanded. The answer didn't come right away. When it did, it wasn't what he expected. "Each other." A chill ran down his spine. "You're not supposed to be here," Richard said. "Any of you." "Neither were we," the voice replied. That stopped him cold. The whispering shifted, growing quieter, more fragmented. Pieces of sentences drifted through the room. "He never came back." "You promised?" "He doesn't remember." Richard clenched his fists. "Remember what?" Silence. Then, the sound of something small and mechanical clicking on. A faint red light appeared at the far end of the living room. Richard's breath caught. He took a step closer, squinting into the darkness. The light was steady, unmoving. A recording device. The realization hit him all at once. These weren't just whispers. They were being played. Controlled. Rewound. Reused. Someone had been curating his memories. "Who's doing this?" Richard demanded. The whisper answered, no longer fragmented, no longer cautious. "Someone who's been waiting a long time for you to hear the truth." The red light blinked once. Then went dark. Richard stood alone in the silence, his heart racing, his mind spinning. The house felt different now, not haunted, not invaded, but staged. Like a set built for a confrontation that hadn't happened yet. And somewhere behind the walls, behind the sealed corridor and the locked door, something waited patiently. Something that knew exactly what it wanted him to hear next. Richard didn't sleep that night either. The hour dragged slowly, and every creak, every whisper of air against the window felt amplified, magnified in the darkness. He had learned one thing: the house was no longer just his. It belonged in some small way to whatever, or whoever, was orchestrating these whispers. And it had plans. By 1:03 a.m. he was pacing the lower level again. The hallway paneling loomed like a silent judge. The sealed corridor had been ignored for too long, and now it called to him with a presence he couldn't ignore. His hand hovered over the seam, but he did not touch it. Not yet. Instead he listened. "He's not ready," the whisper came, soft and precise. The tone suggested patience, but not infinite patience. There was urgency beneath it, a quiet insistence that he act. Richard's mind raced. Not with fear this time, but with calculation. He needed to understand. First the door, then the corridor beyond. Whoever had set this up had access, knowledge, foresight. This wasn't random. The lake outside glimmered faintly in the moonlight. The house remained still, almost expectant. He could hear his own breathing. Every heartbeat was magnified. He reached for the paneling. His fingers brushed the cool surface. The vibration beneath it was subtle but undeniable. Something, or someone, was moving inside. A soft chuckle drifted through the hallway. Oh, familiar. Unsettling. Richard froze. That laugh, it wasn't a stranger's. He didn't recognize it fully, but it carried warmth beneath the edge, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Eleanor? No. Impossible. And yet it carried the cadence, the rhythm, the subtle inflection she had used when she was amused, when she had teased him during arguments about work. He stepped back. His hand fell to his side. Logic argued against it. Memory whispered for him to remember. The house seemed to close in. Shadows stretched along the walls, thickening. The air smelled faintly metallic, like old batteries or machinery. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was deliberate. Richard's mind went to Thomas. He had to be involved. He had to. No one else had the access, the knowledge, the patience. But Thomas would never, would he? Thomas's loyalty was absolute. And yet, something had changed. Something had shifted in the way the house responded, in the timing of the whispers. He moved down the hallway toward the living room. Every step was measured. Barefoot on the polished floor. The faint red light of a night censer illuminated the corridor, making shadows dance across the walls. "He has to see," the whisper said, unmistakable now. Richard froze mid-step. The voice was closer. Too close. Not behind the paneling this time. Not from the speakers. It came from inside the living room behind him. Human. Controlled. Alive. He spun around. Nothing. Just shadows, the furniture arranged perfectly, the room silent. He swallowed hard. His chest felt tight, but he forced himself forward toward the source. The faint click of something mechanical echoed softly. The red light flickered. A small device sat on the coffee table, a recorder active. Its blinking light synchronized with the whispers he had been hearing. Richard exhaled slowly, a shiver running down his spine. Someone had engineered this. Not to scare him. Not for sport. To teach him something. To make him confront something. His gaze swept the room. Nothing else. No intruder. No signs of forced entry. Just the recorder blinking patiently. Waiting. "He's ready," the whisper said, calm now. Convincing. Final. Richard's stomach nodded. He realized with a sinking certainty that opening the sealed corridor door, or confronting whoever was behind this, would mark the beginning of a reckoning he could not yet predict. He stepped back. His mind raced through possibilities, motives, and outcomes. Whoever had done this knew him better than anyone, better than he knew himself. A single thought hammered in his chest. The whispers weren't random. They weren't mistakes. They were instructions. And whatever, or whoever, was guiding him, it had made it clear. Richard Hale would have to follow them. He looked once more at the paneling, then the recorder, then the shadows stretching across the living room. And with a shiver that ran from his fingers to his toes, he understood that the house, and its secrets, would not let him ignore the truth any longer. The whispers were waiting. And so was he. Richard didn't sleep again. By now, the nights had merged into a single stretch of tension. Each whisper, each shadow, each subtle vibration sharpening his senses to an almost painful degree. Even daylight brought no relief. He moved through the house with a heightened awareness, noticing every scuff, every faint hum in the walls, every flicker of light. The estate felt alive, like it had been waiting all these years for him to pay attention. He spent the day trying to ground himself. He reviewed files, returned emails, and attempted phone calls, but every sound, every movement, drew his attention back to the hallway, to the sealed corridor, to the unseen presence that had claimed his home. Even Thomas's presence didn't reassure him now. The house had become a stage, and he was the unwilling actor. As dusk fell, Richard realized he couldn't wait any longer. The whispers had escalated. Their urgency was unmistakable. The recorder, left blinking on the coffee table, had played back fragments of conversation he didn't fully understand. Fragmented sentences, unfinished thoughts, warnings he couldn't place. Whoever was behind it knew how to manipulate him. They had studied him, learned his habits, exploited his grief. By 11:47 p.m., he stood at the base of the stairs, staring at the hallway paneling. The house was unnaturally quiet. The lake outside was still, reflecting the moonlight like a polished mirror. He swallowed hard, his chest tight, and reached for the panel. The vibration was stronger this time. He pressed his palm flat against the smooth surface, feeling a faint hum beneath his fingers. Not mechanical, not electrical, alive. "He's ready now," a whisper said from the corridor, precise and calm. Richard stepped back, heart hammering. The voice had an edge of authority, of inevitability. Whoever it belonged to was confident, patient, and certain. He glanced toward the recorder. The red light still blinked in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Then he understood. It wasn't just a recording device. It was a trigger, a guide, a marker. The whispers were being orchestrated, controlled. Time to elicit specific reactions. Richard's mind raced. Thomas had installed the corridor, yes, but the whispers? The manipulation? That had to be deliberate. Someone had orchestrated the entire environment to lead him here, to push him toward a confrontation he wasn't ready for. He took a deep breath and forced himself forward toward the hallway. The paneling loomed like a silent judge. Shadows stretched along the walls, thin and sharp. The faint metallic smell grew stronger, sharp and intoxicating. His fingers brushed the seam again, hesitating. Then, with deliberate care, he pressed a small latch he hadn't noticed before. The panel swung open smoothly. The narrow corridor beyond was dimly lit by a single low-watt bulb. The walls were lined with wires and cables, neat, deliberate. At the far end, a closed door waited, unassuming, ordinary, but Richard's instincts told him otherwise. He must see, the whisper said again, closer now, urgent but patient. Richard's pulse accelerated. He stepped inside. The corridor felt alive, almost breathing. The wires hummed faintly, the bulb casting long, thin shadows along the floor. His steps echoed softly, each one measured, deliberate. At the far end he stopped. The door. Plain, closed, unassuming, but holding the weight of every secret, every truth he had avoided, every part of his life he had buried. He placed a hand on the doorknob. Cold. Metal. Solid. Real. The whisper came one last time before the moment of confrontation. "Are you ready to hear it?" Richard exhaled slowly, his chest tight, his fingers trembling slightly. He knew in that instant that turning back was no longer an option. He had been led here for a reason. Every sound, every shadow, every whisper had been deliberate. He twisted the knob. The door creaked open, and the truth behind it hit him harder than any deal, any loss, any betrayal ever had. Richard's hand froze on the doorknob. Beyond the door, the corridor stretched wider than he expected, walls painted in a dull cream, lined with shelves and boxes that smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Light spilled from a small lamp near the far wall, weak but enough to illuminate a figure sitting quietly in the shadows. At first, Richard thought it was someone he didn't recognize. Then the figure shifted and the lamplight caught their face. It was a woman. Not a stranger. Not an intruder. A face he hadn't seen in nearly a decade. "Eleanor?" he whispered, disbelief choking him. The figure remained seated, calm, almost serene. "Not exactly," the voice said softly, familiar yet different. "I'm someone you should have remembered." Richard took a step forward, his heart hammering. "You, how is this possible?" The woman, or whatever she was, smiled faintly. "You didn't want to remember. So I waited." Richard shook his head, struggling to process. "Waited? For what? How?" "You've spent years hiding," she said. "From the past. From yourself. From me. But the truth doesn't disappear. It waits. Patiently." Richard's pulse raced. This didn't make sense. Eleanor had been gone, sick, fragile, gone. He had mourned her publicly, privately. The idea that she, or someone resembling her, was here now seemed impossible. The whispers he had been hearing, they weren't random. They were her or someone channeling her. Teaching him. Testing him. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "Who are you really?" She stood slowly, the shadows falling across her features, sharpening the contours. "I'm someone you lost," she said. "Someone you buried beneath silence and pride. Someone you need to face if you want to understand why everything is happening now." Richard's hands trembled. He wanted to back away, to call for Thomas, for help, for anyone, but his feet were rooted. He felt the weight of years pressing down on him. His grief, his guilt, his failures. All of it distilled in this one impossible moment. "You've been hiding," she continued. "Behind deals, behind routines, behind walls. But you can't hide from this." The realization hit him like a physical blow. The whispers. The corridor. Thomas's role. It wasn't just about intrusion. It was about confrontation. About forcing him to see the parts of his life he had buried, the memories he had refused to honor, the promises he had broken. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. "Why now?" "Because now you're ready," she said. "Or at least you think you are. But the truth, the real truth, will test you in ways you're not expecting." She stepped closer, and the faint lamp light revealed something Richard hadn't anticipated. A small stack of letters, bound carefully, labeled in his handwriting from years ago. Memories he had written but never sent. Promises he had made silently, vows he had broken without acknowledgement. His knees weakened. The whispers, the house, the corridor, all of it, was orchestrated to lead him here, to face what he had avoided for years. And then she said something that cut deeper than any grief he had felt before. "You don't just hear the whispers, Richard. You are the reason they exist." For the first time he understood. This wasn't about fear. This wasn't about manipulation. This was about reckoning. The first major plot twist. The whispers were not random. They were designed, curated, and intentional. The corridor, the devices, the timing, it was all to bring Richard face to face with a truth he had hidden from himself. The consequences of his choices, the memory of Eleanor, and the promises he had failed to keep. Richard staggered back, his chest tight. The woman, or the manifestation of Eleanor, watched him, calm, unwavering. "You have a choice," she said softly. "Face it, or continue pretending it doesn't exist." Richard's mind raced, torn between disbelief, fear, and the overwhelming pull of recognition. Every instinct screamed to run. Every heartbeat urged him to confront. And in that narrow corridor, surrounded by shadows and memories, Richard realized something terrifyingly simple. He could no longer escape himself. The whispers had finally led him home. Richard didn't realize he was sitting until the cold of the concrete floor seeped through his clothes. His back rested against the corridor wall, breath shallow, eyes locked on the woman standing a few feet away. The narrow room felt smaller now, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened with everything left unsaid. The woman, Eleanor, or the echo of her, didn't rush him. She folded her hands calmly, watching him the way she used to when he overworked himself late into the night. Patient, observant, almost kind. "You're not real," Richard said finally. His voice sounded thin even to his own ears. She tilted her head slightly. "I'm real enough for this moment." "That's not an answer." "It never was," she replied gently. Richard laughed once, a short, brittle sound. "So what is this? A setup? A cruel experiment? Is Thomas behind this?" Her expression shifted. Just slightly. Enough to be noticeable. "Thomas helped," she said. "But not in the way you think." Richard pushed himself upright, palms pressed flat against the wall for balance. His legs felt weak, unreliable. "Helped with what? Turning my house into a psychological maze? Making me question my sanity?" "You questioned it long before this," she said quietly. "This just removed the distractions." He stared at her, jaw tight. The urge to shout rose in his chest, sharp and sudden, but it faded just as quickly. Anger felt pointless here. Too loud. Too easy. "You died," he said. "I stood at your hospital bed. I signed the papers. I watched them will you away." She didn't deny it. "That's true," she said. "And also incomplete." Richard's pulse quickened. "Explain." She walked past him, unhurried, and picked up one of the boxes from the shelf. Dust rose into the air. She set it down between them and opened it. Inside were folders. Medical documents. Old legal paperwork. A small audio recorder, identical to the one upstairs. "You buried a lot more than grief," she said. Richard leaned closer, scanning the papers. His name appeared repeatedly. So did dates he remembered too well. Meetings he had skipped. Decisions he had postponed. "What is this?" he asked. "Consequences," she said simply. The word landed hard. She knelt beside the box and lifted one folder, flipping it open to a page marked with a faded sticky note. "You remember the clinical trial you funded? The one you pulled out of at the last minute?" Richard swallowed. The numbers didn't add up. The risk was too high. "For you," she said. "Not for the people already enrolled." His chest tightened. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," she interrupted, not sharply but firmly. "And when the trial collapsed, funding vanished. Care stopped. Follow-ups disappeared." Richard looked away. His reflection stared back at him faintly from the metal shelving. "Older. Harder." "That has nothing to do with you," he said. She met his eyes. "I was one of them." The words hung between them, heavy and irreversible. Richard felt the room tilt. "No. You were sick before that. We talked about it." "We talked around it," she replied. "You were busy. I didn't want to be another problem you had to solve." Silence stretched. The hum of the wires in the walls seemed louder now, almost accusatory. "So this is revenge," Richard said. "You haunt my house. You break me down. For what? An apology?" She shook her head. "If this were revenge, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you." "Then what do you want?" She stood, her expression unreadable. "I want you to listen. Not to whispers. To people." Richard scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. "You think this, whatever this is, will change anything?" "I know it already has," she said. He opened his mouth to argue, but a sudden sound cut through the corridor. Footsteps. Not imagined. Not whispered. Real. Measured. Approaching. Richard's head snapped toward the corridor entrance. The footsteps stopped just outside the open panel. A familiar voice spoke from the shadows. "Sir," Thomas said quietly, "we need to talk. Now." Richard felt his stomach drop. Eleanor, or the woman who wore her face, looked past him, calm as ever. "Here comes the part you didn't plan for," she said. Richard turned slowly toward the doorway, heart pounding, realizing the second truth was about to surface, and this time, it wouldn't be shaped by whispers. Richard's head throbbed as the room seemed to shrink around him. Thomas stepped into the narrow corridor, his posture stiff, face pale under the dim lamp. He didn't move closer than necessary, standing just at the edge of the light. Richard's pulse was deafening. He felt trapped, cornered, not by walls but by the weight of everything he had ignored for years. "Sir," Thomas began, voice low, careful, "there are things you need to know. Things I should have told you long ago." Richard's fists clenched. "You? After all this? You let it happen." "I didn't let it happen," Thomas said quickly. "I tried to control what I could. But some of this was beyond even me." The woman, Eleanor or her echo, watched silently, expression calm, almost expectant. Her presence made the tension in the corridor thicker, tangible, like a storm about to break. "Explain," Richard demanded. "Everything. Now." Thomas nodded slowly. He motioned toward the shelves, the boxes, the folders. "It started when you left the foundation underfunded after the trial collapsed. You made decisions for efficiency, for reputation, for safety. You didn't see the lives affected, or you refused to see them." Richard's stomach knotted. I had no choice. The risk was always there," Thomas interrupted. "Yes, but some of us tried to mitigate it. Some of us tried to prevent the worst. You ignored the warning signs." The corridor felt smaller. Each word weighed on Richard like a hammer. "So this, all of this, the whispers, the corridor, the recordings, it's about that?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "Partly. But not only. You have enemies, yes. People who wanted leverage. But more than that, someone believed you needed to confront yourself. Not them. You." Richard shook his head, disbelief twisting his features. "This is insane. All of this to teach me a lesson?" Thomas's expression softened, almost regretful. "Not a lesson. A reckoning. You've spent decades building walls, around yourself, around your grief, around your responsibility. The house, the whispers, everything, they were tools. Nothing more. But they've worked. You're here. You're listening." Richard's chest tightened. "And the woman?" His voice barely rose above a whisper. "The one, in the corridor?" "She's connected," Thomas said carefully. "She's someone you knew. Someone whose life intersected with the decisions you made. Someone who carries your consequences." The word struck Richard harder than any blow. Guilt, shame, disbelief, all tangled together. "She's real," Thomas added softly. "Everything she's saying, every whisper, every test, it's real. Not a trick. Not revenge. A mirror. And right now, she's the only way you can see what you've avoided for so long." Richard's mind spun. Years of grief, ambition, denial, and distraction collided. The whispering, the corridor, the hidden recorder, they weren't random acts of malice. They were orchestrated to force him to face his own failures, his own choices. He swallowed hard. "And I don't know if I'm ready." The woman stepped forward then, her expression calm but unyielding. "You will never be ready. Not truly. You only have to start." Thomas watched quietly, hands clasped. "Whatever comes next, it's your decision. But it's time to stop hiding. Time to see clearly." Richard exhaled, tension coiling in his chest. His eyes swept the corridor, the shelves, the folders, the recorder, and finally Eleanor, or the echo of her. He realized he was standing at a threshold, a line he could not cross lightly. And then he noticed it. The folders on the shelf weren't just documents, they were personal. Letters, photographs, notes, memories he had written and discarded. Evidence of promises broken and moments avoided. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had ignored over the years crashed into him. He understood fully that this confrontation wasn't only about the whispers. It wasn't about the corridor. It was about everything he had buried. Thomas cleared his throat. Sir, the next step is yours. Whatever you choose, it will define what happens next. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the nearest folder. The whispers that had haunted his nights now felt like a push, a direction, a challenge. He lifted the cover carefully, unfolding the papers inside. And with that, the first layer of the second major plot twist began to reveal itself. Someone close to him, someone he trusted, had been guarding secrets about Eleanor and the trial all along. Secrets that would not only redefine the past but also dictate the dangerous choices looming in the present. Richard sank to the floor of the corridor, the folder open on his lap. His fingers trembled as he traced the edges of the documents, the letters, the photographs. Each piece was a shard of memory he had long buried, evidence of mistakes he had refused to face, promises he had broken, lives he had touched and abandoned without fully realizing the consequences. The whispering had stopped now. Silence pressed in from every corner of the corridor. But the weight of the truth was louder than any voice. He picked up a photograph. Eleanor, frail but smiling softly, holding a folder of papers in her hands. The caption in his own handwriting read, "She deserves the truth." One day. A bitter laugh escaped him. One day. He had promised to make it right. And he hadn't. The letters beneath the photograph were addressed to various families involved in the clinical trial, the ones whose care had been neglected after he had pulled funding. Names he remembered. Faces he had avoided thinking about for years. Letters never sent. Apologies never voiced. Responsibility deferred and forgotten. Richard's hands shook as he read the first note aloud, voice cracking. "I am sorry for the oversight. I failed to provide the care you deserved. I will try to make it right." He stopped. "I tried to make it right," he muttered to himself. "I didn't do it." The woman, Eleanor, stepped closer, her expression calm but piercing. "You didn't fail them because of intention," she said softly. "You failed them because you chose convenience over accountability. You chose comfort over truth. And now..." Richard swallowed hard. "Now what?" "Now," she said, "you decide if you're going to continue hiding behind excuses, or if you're finally going to face everything." He felt a tremor in his chest, a mixture of dread and anticipation. This wasn't just about the whispers anymore. This wasn't a test of courage. This was a reckoning, a confrontation with the sum of his choices. He flipped another folder. Inside were documents detailing Eleanor's efforts to maintain care for the patients despite the halted trial. Her notes, her letters, her attempts to reach him, all meticulously recorded. She had fought alone, carried the burden that should have been shared. Richard's throat tightened. Guilt surged through him like a physical force, twisting his stomach into knots. I didn't know," he whispered. "You did," Eleanor said softly. "You just didn't want to." He leaned back against the wall, pressing his palms to his eyes. Years of grief, pride, ambition, and denial collided inside him. Every deal, every acquisition, every public gesture of philanthropy now felt hollow. Not meaningless, but incomplete. Misguided. A faint sound made him look up. Thomas was still at the doorway, silent, observing. The man had been part of orchestrating this confrontation. Not the whispers themselves, but the path to revelation. Thomas had guided him here, but the burden of realization was entirely his. Richard looked back at Eleanor. What now? How am I supposed to fix this?" She stepped closer and placed a hand on the edge of the folder. "You start by acknowledging it, by facing it, by taking responsibility for what you ignored. And then," She hesitated. You listen. To the people whose lives were affected. To the truths you refused to hear. Richard's stomach churned. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to shut the folders, to walk away from the consequences he had long ignored. But a part of him, something he had almost forgotten, urged him forward. He picked up the next folder. And then another. Each one revealed layers of choices he had made and ignored, ripple effects he had never anticipated, truths he had never faced. The realization sank in fully. The whispers, the corridor, the orchestrated confrontation. It had all been a means to force him to confront the lives his decisions had touched. Not abstractly. Not from a distance. Directly, intimately, painfully. And then, as he reached the last folder, he found a small, folded note addressed to him in Eleanor's handwriting. When you're ready to face everything, you'll understand why I never left. I was always waiting, for you to remember, for you to act. Don't waste this chance. Richard held the note, the paper trembling in his fingers. Tears blurred his vision. The whisper of truth, of accountability, of reconciliation, pressed into him with undeniable force. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own life. Not the public version, not the billionaire persona, but the real, flawed human version of himself. And he knew, finally, that the next step would demand everything he had avoided for a decade: courage, humility, and honesty. Richard sat in the narrow corridor long after Eleanor left him to process the folders. The documents felt like chains at first, heavy, binding, relentless, but slowly they started to feel like a map. A roadmap to something he had avoided for far too long. By morning, his decision was clear. He could no longer hide behind silence or wealth. Not when lives had been touched, disrupted, or lost because of choices he had made, or failed to make. He called Thomas first. The house was quiet now, almost eerily so, but he needed support. Not to solve the problem for him, but to have someone who understood the architecture of both the house and the manipulation that had led him here. Thomas, he said, voice firm, resolute. I need a list. All the families. All the patients affected by the trial. I want to see them. I want to listen. No intermediaries. No excuses. There was silence on the other end, and then Thomas exhaled. Understood, sir. I'll prepare it immediately. Are you certain about this? I've never been more certain, Richard replied. The day blurred into preparation. He reviewed the notes Eleanor had left. Letters, apologies drafted but never sent, the timelines of the trial, the medical follow-ups abandoned, the consequences mapped out. He wrote responses in his own hand, not polished press releases, not corporate statements, just honest words. That evening he made the first call. A mother, her voice fragile but wary, answered. He introduced himself, hesitated, and then spoke plainly. I'm here because I need to understand. I need to listen. You deserve that from me. There was a pause, then a cautious, okay. Over the next hour he listened. Listened to heartbreak, frustration, fear, and disappointment. No excuses. No justifications. Only acknowledgement, understanding, and a promise to act. By the time he hung up, he felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief. The whispers of the house felt distant now, almost approving. He had taken the first step. The following days were relentless. He met families, patients, caregivers, every conversation a reminder of what he had ignored. Each story carried weight, sometimes guilt, sometimes gratitude, but always the undeniable truth of impact. He had been powerful, yes, but his influence had come with responsibility he had shirked. And through it all, he felt Eleanor's presence in the corridors of the house, not as a shadow, not as a whisper, but as a guiding hand. Her role in this reckoning had been deliberate, patient, forceful in its subtlety. She hadn't sought revenge, she had demanded accountability. By the end of the first week, Richard felt a transformation inside him. Not instant, not polished, but real. He was no longer just the billionaire, the man who controlled assets and deals. He was Richard Hale, human, flawed, and painfully aware of the consequences of his choices. That night he returned to the corridor. The paneling loomed as it always had, but now it seemed less oppressive, less foreboding. He opened it again, ran his hands along the walls, the narrow passageway echoing faintly under his touch. And there, at the end of the corridor, the door still stood closed. But for the first time it didn't feel threatening. He smiled faintly. "I'll see it through," he whispered. "No more hiding. No more running." Thomas's voice came softly from the doorway. "Sir?" Richard nodded without turning. "It's time to face the rest." Outside, the wind rustled the trees, carrying a quiet approval. The house felt lighter, almost expectant. A new chapter of accountability, humility, and redemption had begun. But even in that moment of resolve, a faint whisper drifted through the hallway, soft, deliberate, unmistakable. "He's only just begun." Richard had thought that confronting the families, listening to their stories, and acknowledging his mistakes would bring closure, or at least a sense of purpose. He was wrong. By mid-morning, Thomas arrived at the estate, unusually tense. "Sir," he said, closing the front door behind him. "We have a problem." Richard frowned. "What problem?" Thomas handed him a tablet. The screen displayed emails, messages, and photos. Not random but targeted. Someone had been monitoring Richard's efforts to contact the families. Someone had taken issue with his attempts at reconciliation. "Who?" Richard asked, heart tightening. "Not who," Thomas said quietly. "More like what?" "One of your board members. Jonathan Creel. He's been quietly undermining the outreach. Trying to intercept families before you can contact them. He wants control, Richard. Your progress is a threat to him." Richard's stomach sank. Creel. Someone he had trusted for years. Loyal in meetings, obedient in public, cunning behind closed doors. A man who knew the inner workings of the foundation, its finances, and its legal leverage. And now, he had a stake in Richard's silence. "He's interfering?" Richard asked, voice tight. Thomas nodded. "Yes. He's using lawyers, PR, and even private investigators. Families have received conflicting messages, some even told not to respond to you." Richard's chest tightened. The reckoning he had started now faced a human obstacle. Not whispers, not corridors, not hidden devices, but someone with influence and ambition. Someone who wanted him to fail. "Show me everything," Richard said, taking the tablet. Thomas nodded. "It's all here." Hours passed as they sifted through emails, intercepted phone calls, and reports. Each piece painted a picture of Creel's network, carefully executed, precise, and dangerous. Richard felt the first real fear he had experienced since the whispers began, not of the unknown, but of someone exploiting the very system he had built. Then came the message that made him freeze. A photo time-stamped yesterday. It showed one of the families he had contacted, the Johnsons, leaving their home with a box of personal belongings. The caption, typed in bold letters, read, "Do not listen to him. He will ruin you." Richard felt anger surge, hot and bitter, but also a deep sense of guilt. His attempts to repair the past were being sabotaged, and lives were already being manipulated because of him. Thomas broke the silence. "Sir, he knows what you're doing. He knows about the corridors, the whispers, everything. He's been watching you for weeks, maybe months. He's waiting for a chance to act." Richard's mind spun. He had faced ghosts, secrets, and hidden truths, but Creel was flesh and blood, with motives, plans, and resources. This was a real threat. He rose from his chair. "Prepare a full report on him. I need everything. His communications, his financial records, his contacts. And Thomas, make sure he doesn't see it coming. Not a single trace. No warning." Thomas hesitated. "Sir, this is dangerous." "I don't care," Richard said firmly. "If I can't make this right because someone is playing games, then all of this, the corridor, the whispers, Eleanor's guidance, means nothing. I will see this through." The hours blurred into night. Richard stayed in the study, poring over records, drafting communications, and planning carefully. The whispers had guided him so far, but now he realized that action required courage, strategy, and focus. Not fear. And then, just as he leaned back, exhausted, a soft knock came at the door. Richard's hand went to the drawer where he kept the folder Eleanor had left him. The knock came again, more insistent. Thomas opened the door cautiously. "Sir, someone's here." Unexpected. Richard walked toward the door, every instinct on high alert. Through the frosted glass, he saw a figure he hadn't expected. Not Creel, not an investigator, not a family member, but someone from Eleanor's past. Someone connected to her fight to maintain care during the trial. Someone with knowledge, proof, and a message that could change everything. Richard's pulse spiked. This was no longer just about reconciliation. This was about exposing hidden truths, confronting betrayal, and discovering allies he hadn't known he had. The door opened slowly, and in the dim light, the figure stepped inside. Someone from Eleanor's past, someone Richard had never suspected, was about to reveal a truth that would redefine everything he thought he knew about her, the trial, and the forces working against him. Richard's hand lingered on the doorframe, heart pounding as the visitor stepped fully into the room. She was older than he remembered from Eleanor's stories, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a presence that demanded attention. Her name, one he hadn't heard in years, flashed in his mind: Margaret Kane. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice steady, controlled, yet carrying an edge of urgency. "We need to talk. Now." Richard swallowed hard. "Margaret, I didn't expect." "You didn't expect the consequences of ignoring the truth," she interrupted sharply, "or the reckoning that comes when whispers turn into action." He gestured to Thomas, who stepped back respectfully. "What are you talking about?" Margaret walked toward the table, placing a folder down with deliberate force. The folder was thick, papers spilling over the sides. "Everything you think you know about Eleanor, about the trial, about what really happened, is only half the story." Richard's stomach tightened. Half the story? He had just spent days facing the parts he knew. Half the story meant there was more, darker, hidden, and perhaps dangerous. "Go on," he said cautiously, his pulse hammering. Margaret took a deep breath. Eleanor wasn't just a participant in the trial. She was fighting from inside. Against people like Creel, against the mismanagement, against anyone who wanted to cut corners and avoid responsibility. She discovered documents, evidence of malpractice, cover-ups. And she tried to protect the patients. All of them. Richard's fists clenched. I thought I knew. I thought I understood her fight." Margaret shook her head. "You didn't? And because of that misunderstanding, you let people suffer unnecessarily. But there's more. Creel, he knew about Eleanor's work. He knew you didn't. And when she died, he seized the opportunity to consolidate power, to control the narrative, to keep you in the dark." Richard felt bile rise in his throat. Creel had been undermining him all along, manipulating his ignorance, exploiting the gaps Eleanor had tried to fill. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, voice tight. "Because time is running out," Margaret said. "He's moving fast. He's interfering with families you're trying to contact. He's covering his tracks, but he underestimates how far you've come, how much you've changed in these past days. And there's one more thing." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Eleanor left a failsafe for you. Something she knew you would need if Creel ever tried to manipulate the truth again. A final record hidden. Evidence that will expose him, protect the families, and give you the leverage to make real change. But it's not easy to find. And Creel is already looking for it." Richard's mind raced. A hidden record. Proof. Redemption. And a dangerous adversary racing against him. "Where is it?" he demanded. Margaret glanced at him, eyes sharp. "That, Mr. Hale, is something you'll have to earn." Eleanor left clues, encrypted files, and messages hidden throughout the trial archives. Only someone who truly understands her methods, and her mind, can access it. Richard felt the weight of responsibility press down on him like never before. He had faced whispers, corridors, ghosts, and guilt, but now the stakes were tangible, immediate, and potentially life-altering. "I'll find it," he said, voice firm. "Whatever it takes." Margaret nodded. "Good. Because Creel isn't going to wait. And if you hesitate, he will destroy every chance you have at redemption, for yourself and for those who were hurt." Thomas stepped closer. "Sir, do you want me to start investigating immediately?" Richard shook his head. "No, not yet. First, I need to understand Eleanor's clues. I need to follow the path she left. Margaret's eyes softened slightly, almost approvingly. Then you're ready. And this time, the whispers, the corridors, the past, they're no longer your guides. You are. Richard took a deep breath. For the first time he felt a sense of clarity. The past had been revealed, the present was a battlefield, and the future demanded action. He would face Creel, follow Eleanor's trail, and finally take responsibility, not through whispers but through deliberate choices. And as Margaret left, disappearing back into the shadows of the night, Richard realized one undeniable truth. He was no longer reacting to the past. He was shaping the future, and the consequences would be his to bear. Richard sat in the study, the folder Margaret had left beside him. His hands hovered over the papers, then settled on the first encrypted note Eleanor had hidden among her archives. Lines of handwriting twisted with codes and references only someone deeply familiar with her work could follow. Each symbol, each mark, felt like a breadcrumb on a trail she had carefully laid out for him. Thomas leaned against the doorway, quiet but watchful. "Do you need help decoding it?" he asked. Richard shook his head. "No. I have to do this myself. She left it for me, not anyone else. I have to think like her." Hours passed. The soft hum of the night, the distant rustling of trees outside, and the faint creak of the old house became the only sounds as he pored over the notes. Each puzzle, each reference to a patient, a file, or a date, forced him to confront not only the technical challenge but the emotional one, the lives Eleanor had fought for and the consequences of his past inaction. A sudden knock at the front door jolted him. Richard froze. He hadn't expected anyone. Thomas moved to the door cautiously. "Sir, it's probably nothing," he said, but Richard shook his head, tension coiling in his chest. He approached the door slowly and peered through the frosted glass. A man stood there, formal, polished, eyes sharp. Jonathan Creel. Richard's stomach tightened. Creel had found him, or at least discovered his attempts to dig deeper. The man's smirk was faint but deliberate, a subtle taunt in the dead of night. Creel spoke through the door. "Richard, I see you've been busy. Thought you could dig through the past and come out clean? You're moving faster than I expected. But not fast enough." Richard's pulse hammered. He glanced at Thomas. "Don't let him in. Not until I know what he's planning." Creel's voice dropped, almost a whisper. "You can't hide from the consequences forever. I know Eleanor left you something, and I know you'll try to use it. But you're too slow, too sentimental. And some people deserve to be stopped." The words hit harder than any threat he had imagined. This wasn't just professional interference. This was a direct attempt to control, manipulate, and undermine him. Thomas's hand hovered over the phone. "Shall I call security?" Richard shook his head, determination hardening in his chest. "No. I won't hide. I won't run. If he wants to play games, I'll follow the path Eleanor left. And I'll beat him at his own game." The next hours became a blur of codes, hidden messages, and encrypted files. Richard discovered that Eleanor had embedded not only the location of the hidden record but instructions to protect it, including warnings about Creel's methods. Every clue challenged him intellectually and emotionally, forcing him to confront guilt, grief, and pride. By midnight, Richard found the first major lead, a folder marked "Trust No One." Inside, detailed instructions connected Creel to the ongoing interference with families, evidence of obstruction, and even proof of his attempts to manipulate legal documents to prevent Richard from acting. Eleanor had anticipated everything. Richard exhaled, a mix of relief and renewed tension coursing through him. The path was becoming clear, but Creel wasn't idle. Every step forward had to be precise. Every decision mattered. The whispers that had haunted him for weeks now felt distant. Not because they were gone, but because they had served their purpose. Eleanor's trail demanded more than passive listening. It demanded action, intelligence, and courage. And as he stared at the folder, the shadows stretching across the study walls, Richard realized one undeniable truth. Creel's interference was only the beginning. The second confrontation, the one that would test not only his intellect but his moral courage, was imminent. The faint creak of the corridor panel behind him reminded him that the house, the past, and Eleanor's guidance were still watching. And he knew with every fiber of his being that failure was no longer an option. Richard's hands shook slightly as he traced the last symbol in Eleanor's carefully encrypted instructions. The folder, "Trust No One," lay open beside him, papers scattered across the desk. Every clue, every code, every breadcrumb led him to a single conclusion. The hidden record was real and it was within his reach, but so was Creel. Thomas paced behind him, quietly reviewing the security feeds. "Sir, he's still outside. Waiting. Watching." "This isn't going to be subtle," he said. Richard exhaled slowly. "I don't need subtle. I need precise. Eleanor prepared this for me. Every step she left was deliberate. I follow her lead and I get the record. No hesitation." Hours passed. Following the trail, he navigated through encrypted files, cross-referencing patient records, trial notes, and Eleanor's annotations. The process was painstaking, emotionally exhausting. Every page reminded him of the lives affected, the promises broken, and the consequences he had ignored. But it also reinforced his purpose. He wasn't just seeking the record. He was honoring Eleanor's fight, rectifying his negligence, and reclaiming his own integrity. Then the breakthrough came. A hidden directory in the trial archives contained a coded video file labeled "Final Test." Richard's stomach tightened. This had to be it. The record Eleanor had promised, the proof that could expose Creel and protect the families. He clicked play. The screen flickered to life. Eleanor's face appeared, alive and vivid, speaking directly to him despite the years that had passed. "Richard," she said, voice calm but firm, "if you're watching this, you've followed the path. You've listened, you've faced yourself, and you're ready. Creel will try to manipulate, to intimidate, to silence you. But you must act. The families depend on your choices, your courage, and your willingness to face the truth. Everything you see here, documents, recordings, evidence, is the culmination of my work. Use it wisely. Protect them. Stop him." Richard's chest tightened. This wasn't just evidence. It was a blueprint, a moral imperative, and a challenge all at once. He felt Eleanor's presence in the room, guiding him, urging him forward. A sudden noise behind him made him jump. The study door had creaked open. Creel's shadow fell across the floor, imposing and deliberate. "Enjoying the archives, Richard?" Creel said smoothly, stepping closer. "I see you found Eleanor's little failsafe. Clever. But far too late." Richard rose slowly, positioning himself between the screen and Creel. "It's never too late. Not when you've been given the truth." Creel's lips curled into a thin smile. "Truth? You think a few documents and a video will undo years of control? I've built influence, alliances, and power you can't begin to counter. You're still just reactive." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Maybe. But I'm done hiding. I'm done running from the consequences. I've faced myself, Eleanor's truths, and the families. You're the one who's underestimated the cost of manipulation." Creel laughed, cold and sharp. "You're emotional, Richard. And emotions cloud judgment." "Then watch carefully," Richard said, pulling up the evidence on the main screen. Emails, intercepted communications, legal manipulations, all clearly documented. The patterns, Creel's interference, the impact on families, all undeniable. Creel's smirk faltered. He stepped closer, trying to maintain composure. "That's circumstantial. You think you can bring me down with files and videos?" Richard shook his head slowly. "Not think. No. This is Eleanor's work. Her fight. And it's ours now." The confrontation became tense, almost electric. Creel lunged to snatch the tablet from Richard, but Thomas stepped forward with a silent warning, hand hovering near the security override. In that moment, Richard realized something essential. The whispers, the corridors, and the hidden record were not just tools. They were Eleanor's extension, a guide through strategy, morality, and courage. And now he had the final piece: action. With deliberate calm, Richard spoke, projecting authority he hadn't known he possessed. "Step back, Creel. This ends tonight." Creel hesitated, calculating, and in that pause Richard knew he had the leverage he needed. The evidence on the screen was undeniable, the moral high ground unshakable, and Eleanor's voice, her presence, strong and guiding. The final confrontation had begun. Creel's eyes darted across the screen. For the first time since he had stepped into the study, his confidence cracked. The evidence wasn't fragmented. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't circumstantial. It was systematic. Emails coordinating interference with families. Legal drafts designed to intimidate patients into silence. Financial transfers rerouted through shell accounts to conceal pressure tactics. Eleanor hadn't just suspected him. She had documented him. Thomas stepped fully into the room now, calm but unyielding. "Security has been notified," he said quietly. "And copies of these files have already been scheduled for release to the board and external counsel if anything happens to Mr. Hale." Creel's jaw tightened. "You're bluffing." Richard met his gaze steadily. "I'm not the man you've been manipulating anymore." Silence stretched between them, thick and electric. For years, Richard would have avoided this moment. He would have negotiated, compromised, protected reputation over truth. Not tonight. "You thought I wouldn't dig," Richard continued. "You thought grief made me weak. That guilt made me predictable. But you underestimated the one thing Eleanor never did." "And what's that?" Creel snapped. Richard's voice didn't waver. "Growth." That word landed harder than any accusation. Creel's posture shifted from aggressive to calculating. He stepped back slightly, reassessing. "Even if you expose me, Richard, you destroy yourself. The board will ask questions. Investors will panic. The press will tear you apart. You'll lose control of everything you built." Richard felt the weight of that truth. Yes, there would be fallout. Yes, his name would be dragged through headlines. Yes, the public would learn about the trial collapse, the funding withdrawal, the negligence. But for the first time, that didn't terrify him. "I should have lost control years ago," Richard said quietly. "When I stopped listening." Creel stared at him, searching for doubt. He found none. Thomas's phone buzzed. He glanced down. "Security is entering the property." Creel inhaled sharply. "You think this ends with me walking out in handcuffs? You think that's justice?" "No," Richard replied. "Justice starts with transparency." He reached for the keyboard and pressed a single key. The scheduled release activated. Encrypted packets containing Eleanor's video, the financial trails, and Creel's communications were sent simultaneously to the Foundation's board, independent auditors, and legal oversight. There was no turning back. Creel lunged toward the desk, but Thomas blocked him firmly. The study door opened moments later as security stepped inside. Creel didn't resist. But as they escorted him out, he looked back at Richard with cold fury. "This will cost you everything." Richard held his gaze. "Then it's finally worth something." The door shut. Silence flooded the study. Richard stood still, heart pounding, but not from fear. From clarity. The storm had broken. Thomas approached carefully. "Sir, the board will call within the hour." "I know," Richard said. "And the media won't be far behind." "I know." Thomas studied him for a moment. "Are you ready?" Richard looked at the screen where Eleanor's face had frozen mid-sentence. "Protect them. Stop him." He exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, he said, "Yes." By morning, the fallout had begun. Emergency board meetings. Legal reviews. Statements drafted and redrafted. News outlets requesting confirmation. Investors demanding explanations. But something unexpected happened. Families began calling. Not with anger. With support. Word had spread that Richard had reached out personally. That he had listened. That he had chosen exposure over silence. One message in particular stood out, a voicemail from Mrs. Johnson. "We saw the news," she said softly. "You didn't have to do that. But you did. That matters." Richard closed his eyes as he listened. This wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Late that evening, exhausted, he walked back toward the corridor. The house felt different now. Not haunted. Not oppressive. Quiet. He opened the hidden panel one last time. The corridor light flickered on gently. At the far end, the door stood slightly ajar. No whispers. No vibrations. Just stillness. Richard stepped inside and looked around. The shelves, the folders, the wires, tools that had forced him to confront himself. "I understand now," he said softly into the empty space. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, so faintly he almost missed it, a whisper brushed the air. "Almost." Richard's breath caught. He turned slowly. On the far shelf, beneath the folders he had already opened, sat one final sealed envelope he hadn't seen before. No label. No markings. Just his name written across the front in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. Richard Hale. His pulse quickened again. The confrontation with Creel was over. But Eleanor had one more truth waiting. And somehow he knew this final revelation wouldn't just challenge his past. It would redefine his future. Richard stood motionless in the narrow corridor, staring at the final envelope. His name, written in Eleanor's handwriting. No codes. No encryption. No warnings. Just Richard Hale. For a long moment he didn't move. After everything, the whispers, the confrontation, Creel's exposure, this felt different. Not strategic. Not tactical. Personal. His fingers brushed the paper. It was thicker than ordinary stationery. Sealed carefully. Intentionally. He broke it open. Inside was a single folded letter. No documents. No evidence. No leverage. Just words. He unfolded it slowly. "Richard, if you're reading this, then you've done the hardest part. You've stopped running. I never wanted to haunt you. I never wanted revenge. I wanted you to wake up before your silence became permanent. You think the trial was your greatest failure. It wasn't. Your greatest failure was believing you had to carry everything alone. You built walls so high that even I couldn't reach you at the end. Not because you didn't love me, but because you didn't know how to be vulnerable without feeling weak. The whispers weren't punishment. They were a reminder. You are not powerful because you control outcomes. You are powerful when you choose accountability. Creel was never the real test. The real test was whether you would choose truth over image when it cost you everything. You did. Now there is one last thing you must do. Forgive yourself. Not to erase the past, but to ensure you don't repeat it. Live differently, Richard. Not louder. Not bigger. Just truer. I was never waiting in the corridor. I was waiting in you. Eleanor. Richard didn't realize he was crying until a tear fell onto the paper. All this time he thought he had been chasing evidence, fighting enemies, correcting mistakes. But this was the core. He had spent years punishing himself quietly, burying grief under control, mistaking distance for strength. The whispers hadn't been about fear. They had been about awakening. Slowly he looked around the corridor one final time. The shelves were just shelves now. The wires were just wires. The light was steady. No vibration beneath the walls. No presence lingering in the air. Only silence. Peaceful silence. He walked back into the main hallway and closed the hidden panel. Not as someone sealing away a secret, but as someone closing a chapter. The weeks that followed were not easy. Board investigations concluded. Creel faced charges. Structural reforms were implemented within the foundation. Independent oversight was installed. Richard stepped down temporarily from direct control, publicly acknowledging his failures and outlining the corrective measures. The media cycle was brutal, but something unexpected grew beneath it: trust. Families he had met began collaborating with the foundation on rebuilding patient care programs. Eleanor's archived research became the basis for a new, transparent initiative, one named not after Richard but after her: the Eleanor Hale Patient Advocacy Fund. No grand gala, no dramatic speech, just quiet commitment. Richard visited patients without cameras, listened more than he spoke, asked questions he once avoided. At home, the estate felt lighter. Open windows, sunlight in the hallways, no late-night pacing, and no whispers. One evening, months later, he stood by the lake, watching the reflection of the sky ripple across the water. Thomas approached quietly. "Sir, you've changed." Richard smiled faintly. "I hope so. Do you still think about the corridor?" "Every day," Richard said. "But not the way I used to." Thomas studied him. "And the whispers?" Richard looked out at the horizon. "They weren't whispers," he said softly. "They were truths I was finally ready to hear." The wind moved gently across the lake. No eerie chill. No hidden message. Just air. Just life. Richard exhaled, steady and unburdened. For the first time in years, he wasn't reacting to the past. He wasn't chasing redemption. He was simply living, aware, accountable, and present. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between memory and growth, Eleanor's final lesson remained. Not all hauntings are meant to destroy you. Some are meant to rebuild you. The end.